Thank you, Dave. It's been a long, strange, twisted journey that we've all taken to get to tonight. I first congratulate you for your efforts. I know that you've had this and several other versions that I've been co-sponsor on all of, and I've had a bill of my own. I won't belabor some of the points that my colleague just made, but I do want to make sure that we emphasize a few things. This version, and just for everyone's clarity, this version of the bill that or the resolution that we're going to consider tonight is identical to the one that we took up a year ago in June last year, post-budget, that is different from the budget version that the Senate passed in the sense that the Senate version was broader in scope, less limited. It applied to a wider number of state retirement members, and this bill has been crafted to be significantly more restrictive. Is that fair to say?
Well, I would say that with the exception of potentially the last statement, largely correct. The one thing I will point out, though, is this amendment has been crafted in part with an eye towards actually getting it enacted into law. And as someone who believes that ultimately the goal of all of us as legislators is to produce results, being able to achieve that is as important a part of the drafting process as anything.
I couldn't agree more, but now I've got a question as far as actually being drafted or crafted into law. Certainly, you don't think that the public would have an issue passing this version or the Senate version into law, do you?
I believe that the public of New York, upon being presented a pension forfeiture constitutional amendment, will pass it overwhelmingly.
Any version of it would likely to pass. But, I mean, the Senate version, certainly, the Senate indicated 14 and a half months ago that they would pass the more restrictive or broader version that captures everybody. So if we pass the same version that the Senate passed 14 and a half months ago at budget time, well, I don't understand what the obstacle you perceive to the Senate version becoming law, other than getting through this body.
Well, I point out that in general, for pieces of legislation, after January 1st, both houses have to pass a piece of legislation. We've obviously made some reforms under leadership of our Speaker to modify some of that process here in the Assembly so that starting with the next edition of our legislature, we won't have as much of a hurdle over January 1st, and we'll have more of a two-year type session. But that's not the currently established rules. So in general, a piece of legislation does have to pass both houses in the same year.
All right, well, let me ask a couple of, I won't say they're hypotheticals, they're real-life case studies for clarity for everyone in the chamber here. Had this constitutional amendment been in place a few years ago, the recent trials and convictions of former Speaker Silver and former Senate Majority Leader Skelos, would they be on the hook to lose their pensions?
I guess it depends on what a few years ago means, but
if it was in place at the time of their crime.
If it was in place 20 years ago?
Sure.
They were obviously both elected officials and therefore could have been subject to a provision like this.
All right. If this was law at the time and, say, a prison worker helped two convicted murders, one a cop killer, and the other somebody that dismembered an elderly person, escaped from a maximum security prison and be on the lam terrorizing the North Country for 3 weeks and costing the state of New York $23 million, would that state employee be eligible to keep their pension, or would that pension be protected, or would that be in jeopardy?
On the assumption that person is not a policymaker or otherwise qualifies under one of the other provisions, no, this is not a constitutional amendment that applies to all public employees in the state of New York.
I think this question may have been asked, but I want to ask one more time. I mean, the idea to me of a constitutional amendment is big picture, broad strokes, and then what follows from that, what derives from the Constitution, the laws that we pass every day. They're not constitutional amendments. They get their authority from the Constitution. So, for example, in the Second Amendment, you say the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. You don't say you can't discharge a firearm within 500 feet of a house, and these are the hunting regulations, and these are the hunting seasons. That's law. That's not in the Constitution. So what is the hesitation in this bill or in this House to have a broad, flexible living amendment that from that implementing language could be debated on this floor, and perhaps that would be the place to put these added protections and restrictions in, so that maybe if this body decided, you know what, we want to be able to rip the pension from somebody that helped two convicted murderers escape from a maximum security prison, that we would have that option. Under your draft of this amendment, that's not an option.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to commend my learned colleague for acknowledging the wisdom of sensible gun safety legislation, completely consistent with interpretations of the Second Amendment. I think that it's very wise that we, in fact, understand that there's a lot of legislating to do, even in light of important constitutional rights. As to this matter, I think it's certainly fair to say that this is not the only way the legislature can address corruption in government, or can address the punishments for those who are involved in corruption. But this is an effort to send a very tangible message that we are turning the page and will not stand for corruption in one of the most high-profile ways. And it's certainly true that there are going to be circumstances that aren't fully captured by this. We're going to have a lot more work to do beyond just the subject of pension forfeiture. That having been said, by getting this constitutional amendment to the point where it is on the verge of being able to become part of our state constitution, and obviously, as we've talked about, that process takes a few years because amending the Constitution is and should be a difficult process. We are taking tangible steps so that we convey not just to those public officials who are subject to pension forfeiture, but really to all public officials, that when they take their oath of office and commit themselves to serving the people of New York, something we hold them to a very high standard. And, you know, I like to think that the leaders of departments, policymakers, and otherwise are there in part to set the example. So this is something that certainly accomplished that, and I would like to think that everyone who oversees a department or an office in the state of New York is able to convey how important the people of New York view this, so that malfeasance in office is diminished.
Thank you. I have one more question for you, and I appreciate your entertainment here, David. Certainly, we've all been around here long enough to know that big issues like this don't get decided on a whim. Lord knows we've had 14 and a half months since the Senate passed the budget agreed to version. And I haven't been privy to all the discussions that have occurred by members in this room. But I'm curious, you know, now here we are, last day of session-ish here, and last window to, yeah, you like that? This is the last opportunity we'll have by this legislature, and as my colleague pointed out earlier, if we don't do it this year, then we will lose essentially 2 more years of this process. So very important question to ask here, is the Senate on the same page? I don't want to go home like we did in 2015 and have everyone in this chamber running around with a victory lap saying we did pension forfeiture and the other house didn't, and then have the same problem where the Senate is running around saying we did pension forfeiture, oh, by the way, the version that was agreed to in the budget negotiations, and the Assembly didn't. We cannot have this situation going on. The state of New York, the people of the state of New York do much better than the legislature doing this and getting nothing done. So how certain are you that the Senate is on the same page with the Assembly, and that we are going to have a matching set of bills? Schoolhouse Rock says for something to become law, it has to match both houses.
Well, Mr. Speaker, let me say I am personally totally committed to seeing the Assembly and the Senate pass the same constitutional amendment. I believe that is going to happen, but I've committed myself to that throughout this year, and frankly, as extension of the 4 years that I've been pushing for a pension forfeiture constitutional amendment. I believe that this is something that in the fullness of time over the not too distant future, we will be able to see that results are achieved for the people of New York. But obviously, we remain in session so that we know that that is happening.
All right, thank you. Mr. Speaker, on the bill.
On the bill, sir.
Well, first I want to thank Mr. Buchwald for his efforts on this, and we've shared this journey together for the last 4 years, and I'm glad to see that we're on the cusp. I thank the Speaker for his role here, and I understand the issues here, and I understand what has to happen in Albany. But with that said, the past transgressions of some of our former members, some of the Senate's former members, and frankly some other non-elected members have caused the people of the state of New York to question the credibility, the trustworthiness of their elected officials and many of their non-elected officials. And our own lack of action on this in the last few years has been very obvious to all of our constituents, and frankly, it's been inexcusable and unforgivable. I suppose late is better than never, but we need to move this forward, and I implore everyone in here and the speakers here, I'm glad that we need to make sure that we are on the same page with the Senate, and hopefully that'll happen. But this is long overdue, and I personally would have gone farther. I would have liked the larger universe. That would have given us the flexibility to address those truly egregious situations. Somebody allows 2 convicted murderers to escape. That to me is worthy of stripping somebody of their pension. This bill, unfortunately, will not allow that punishment applied to that crime. So this is a subset of the universe that I wish we would go after. But I suppose at the end of the day, the old saying, half a loaf is better than none. So while I would have liked, I think this could have been better, broader. This is what's in front of us, and I'm not going to say no to it. I will be supporting this bill. I encourage my colleagues to support this bill. More importantly, I encourage our leadership to make sure that the Senate ensures that we have matching first passages of this constitutional amendment so that we can get off this dime finally, get second passage next year, and get this to the voters, where I know that you will see a tremendous outpouring of support for a constitutional amendment here. And as Mr. Buchwald pointed out, this is only the beginning of our ethical journey. This is something we should have done 14 and a half months ago. We should be focusing on other ethics reform. And by my watch, it's 11 o'clock at night, and we're going to be back here tomorrow, one extra day. And we don't, unless there's a calendar that I'm not aware of, we don't have any other ethics reforms in front of the House here this session. I think that's an opportunity lost. But again, I will be supporting this amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.